Leaders of the BRICS nations have begun their summit in Brazil by condemning US and Israeli attacks on Iran and calling on Israel to withdraw troops from the Gaza Strip. Our executive editor for economics and government in EMEA and LATAM, Flavia Krause-Jackson, joins us now from Rio de Janeiro. So, Flavia, tell us about sort of the headline discussions that are taking place amidst what is, of course, an interesting backdrop in terms of some of these key players from Iran, from Russia, from China actually not being there at this gathering.
Yeah, it's quite an unusual BRICS in many ways, right? Because two of the big acronyms in that grouping are not here. President Xi's not here, and of course Putin isn't here either. So that makes it, in a way, quite an unusual, understated affair. And then, of course, you have, in the form of Lula, a very punchy host. He's obviously here, very warm, being with Modi, who's the star of the show, really, and he's going to be treated to a state visit later. But Lula really marches to the beat of his own drum. He's not afraid to say controversial things. And of course, in the backdrop, you have the tariffs that are about to come down, and certainly tomorrow we'll see some of these deals, if they come into shape, especially the one with India. We'll be able to get some real-life reactions here in Rio. And of course, on the geopolitics, the BRICS have really stood apart as presenting themselves as a sort of alternative to the US order, and ironically as defenders of multilateral institutions. So it's quite interesting, really, to sort of see in the family picture Russia and Iran sort of relegated to the margins, and also the kind of language that they're using to condemn some of the actions in the Middle East.
Yeah, it will really not play well for President Trump, that, of course, is meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday at the White House.
No, of course not. And I mean, I think what's been very interesting to see is that Lula and Trump could not be further apart. But somewhat unusually, Trump has not picked a fight with Lula and vice versa. Certainly, Brazil hasn't been caught in the crosshairs of the trade war. And Lula himself has said some pretty contrarian things about Israel that in the past, certainly when he said it in the G20 context, drew a lot of condemnation. But here, he's very much more with like-minded individuals. It's obviously the G20, the BRICS aspires to be very much like the G20, but hasn't quite lived up to the promise, even though it represents 49% of the population and has certainly doubled in size. But one thing, for example, that we noticed is that for 2 years ago, when Saudi Arabia and several other countries were invited, essentially doubling the size of the BRICS to 11, countries like Saudi Arabia specifically are still equivocating and not entirely sure that this is a club that they want to be a member of.
Chinese Premier Li Qiang saying that BRICS countries should champion the peaceful resolution of international disputes. How well has Beijing really driven the BRICS nations in order to gain more global clout, not to mention expand the grouping as well?
Well, I mean, obviously those are interesting words, but the fact that they're not spoken by Xi in this setting, in a way, kind of doesn't pack as much of a punch. And I think suddenly there's a sort of perception that China really maintains always the same position. It doesn't really want to tip the balance in any specific way. When it's come to the conflict in Ukraine, it's very much given backing to Russia. When it comes to Iran, another ally in the Middle East, it hasn't actually done very much to help that ally. So those positions are very much consistent with how China has sort of essentially positioned itself geopolitically. It uses words, but it doesn't really follow through with actions.